So before we get started, I will just mention, so last week we spoke about bittul, right? And we translated it as surrender. And the question was asked, aren't we supposed to, build ourselves up? Aren't we supposed to know who we are and work on our character, turn ourselves in? So I was just thinking, when you have someone that learns to be a police officer, a firefighter, a soldier, so they spend their whole lives working on themselves and honing in on their talents or building the characteristics necessary, good evening, to be able to run into the fire. But when the fire breaks out, or when the criminal pulls out his gun and starts shooting, they totally lose focus. They're not thinking about what they need, what they train. They're thinking about what they're needed for in this moment. They're not thinking about themselves in this moment. They're the tool. And this is bittul. This takes a lifetime of work to build yourself up so that when you face God, when you're facing your true self, it's not about you. It's about what you're needed for. And sort of in that moment, they sort of become consumed or subsumed in an entity that's much greater than them. This is really what bittul is. So a yesh, something that's created, is its own existence, has its own independence, and that's wonderful. But the purpose is to build up this yesh to the point that he or she can lose themselves in something that's much greater than them, and achieve bittul. Before we continue to tonight's lesson, I did just want to make a brief introduction that what is Kabbalah? And Kabbalah means received. This is information that was received by our sages from Moses at Sinai and from different types of communications that they had with whether it be angels or souls that have passed. This is information that's received, and that's why it's esoteric. That's why it's very difficult for the average person to be able to strip away all of their preconceived notions, all of our usual tools that we use to understand things, and be able to understand such abstract ideas without materializing it, without humanizing it. So what does it help? It helps. Why are we studying it? It helps us to understand sort of like the DNA of everything in existence. So you look at something. A lot of times when you see something for the first time, you think, "Oh, that's simple. I could do that." And then when you start trying to do it, you realize how difficult it really is. It happens all the time. If something new comes out and you have the option, should I buy it pre-assembled or should I assemble it myself? And your first thought is, I'll save some money and buy it, I'll assemble it myself. And then you get it in the mail and you realize how big of a mistake it was, assuming you're like me and can't figure out how to use a screwdriver. If you know how to, then by all means. So something that came to mind was that, there was a husband that came home. Every day he'd come home from work and he'd ask his wife, how was your day? And she would share. He'd ask her what she did all day. She stayed at home. She took care of the house. She took care of the kids. And every day he would ask her, how she was, what she did. One day he comes home and the home is a turnover. It's a mess. So he turns to her and he says, "What happened today?" So she says, "You know how every day you ask me what I did? Today, I didn't do it." So we are discovering how we work how the world works, why God created the world to work in such a way so that when we see how sophisticated and how complicated our own lives are and how difficult it is for us to change things, to fix things, so to speak, or to focus on things that we're not focused on, when we understand why it's difficult and why it's not working, we could hopefully figure out a way to fix it and to work on it and to understand it. Today we're going to we are lesson 2 of your once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to become a trained Jewish mystic. Just a minute. So I don't have too many things flying around here. And we are going to look tonight at not what we do, think, and speak, but who we are. And based on that, we're going to try to figure out where we should go, what we should do. How do I decide what I should do with my life? I wake up one morning and I decide, time to grow up. I just graduated school, time to look for a job. What should I look for? What should I aspire to? So there are some possible factors that we can take into consideration. What are some things you would take into consideration when you think about what you should do with your life?
What you're good at.
What you're good at.
What's your interest or inclination towards something?
What your inclination towards something is. What you like to do.
Where you're located.
Where you're located. Payment. Okay. What you? Yeah. If it's enough to get you through.
What allows you to have work-life balance? You don't want to.
Okay. How it can fit into your life and it doesn't destroy your life. So there are a number of things. Also, sometimes family history plays into it. You forget you just graduated school. What do you know how to do? Hopefully that plays into it also a little bit. Sometimes you think about what the need is in the moment, depending on where you live or the time you live in. Do you enjoy it? Are you good at it? Sometimes you might look at what you find particularly difficult and challenging because you want to challenge yourself, or what makes your parents proud. Depending on what type of person you are, you don't want to end up a disappointment. They tell the story of Albert Einstein. He was on the train, and the conductor was coming around to get to stamp the tickets. And when he gets to Einstein's seat, he can't find his tickets. He starts checking in his jacket pockets. So the conductor turns to him and says, "Mr. Einstein, Dr. Einstein, we all know who you are. We know you bought a ticket. You're too recognizable. You wouldn't be able to. We know you bought a ticket. Don't worry about it." So the conductor keeps on going. He gets to the end of the train and he sees that Einstein is on the floor looking under a seat looking for his ticket. So the conductor tells him, "I told you, we know who you are. You don't need to look for your ticket." So Einstein turns to him and says, "I appreciate that, young fellow, but I need to know where I'm going." So we have to know where we're going. And that's why in the previous class, if you take out your maps or if you look at the screen, you will see we discussed our soul garments. Our soul garments. And they were thought, speech, and action. In today's class, we are going to go into we're going to see past these garments. We're going to see the soul powers, who we are on the inside, what we're made of. And this brings us to the first Hebrew term of the day. These Hebrew terms, some of them I will use in Hebrew, some of them I will continue to use in English, but I think it's important to at least familiarize yourself with these terms. There's a lot of them, so I know you won't be able to remember all of them. If I use a term and you don't remember what it is, just raise your hand or call out and ask me to translate. But this is going to be kochot hanefesh. So last week, if you look at the back of the map, you'll see 1.5, the last term in last week's lesson was levushe hanefesh, the garments of the soul, nefesh being the soul. The first term of today is kochot hanefesh. Koach means power, the powers of the soul powers. And these are going to be 10 powers, generally divided into two, intellect and emotion. Today, we will primarily focus on emotions. Next week, although we're not going to be focusing on intellect, we will discuss intellect next week as part of next week's class that will go a step higher. Yeah.
Is seichel head? Or
Seichel, intellect. Seichel is mind.
Is it Yiddish or is it Hebrew?
No, Hebrew. Moach is the brain. Seichel is intellect. Like, so you'll say, you have no seichel.
Yeah.
Right. So that means, today you say these words and it's child abuse, but that's what it is. Okay. So now, just like last week, we discussed how these soul garments correspond to, on the left side of the map, to the spiritual worlds of Bia, Bria, Yetzira, and Asiya. Today, we are going to discuss the fourth world, the world of Atzilus, or Atzilut. And this is going to cover all 10 attributes, as you can see on your screen or on the chart, the green. This week's class is green, and the green covers the 10 sefirot in God, and then the 10 soul powers the way they are in a human being, in us, and in the world in general. Okay. Before we begin with Atzilus, let's start within the person. But before we begin, it's important to note the following. Atzilus right now means another name. We're not going to understand what Atzilus means for another little bit, so let's just keep that in mind. Atzilus is, there's a lot attached to it. It says the Alter Rebbe, when he would write Atzilus, many times couldn't write more than the first three letters, Aleph, Tzadik, Yud. He couldn't write beyond that. And once we understand what Atzilus is, we may understand why that is so. But let's begin with a question that I think deserves asking, especially that we're getting. Last week, Biyah were creations, God's creations. We could talk about creations. We're creations. We can talk about creations. No matter how high the creations are, it's not God. But this week, we're not talking about creations. Bria is the first creation. Now we're talking about God. So here it gets a little tricky. How do we talk about God? In what way? What can we assume? So the first question we have to ask ourselves is, can we say that God is fill in the blank? Okay, so if you want to be nice, he's like, is God is kind? Can you say that? Can you say God is kind? Isn't that very limiting?
I mean, no matter what you say, it's not part of
So it's not God.
Wouldn't it be an attribute of God?
So in other words, is it okay to say that God has attributes? So one reaction is, why not? What's the problem? What's the problem with God having attributes, especially if they're good ones?
Do the 13 attributes like.
Very good. So
4,000
So you're getting ahead of yourself. You're not ahead of yourself. You're getting ahead of me. But really, you're getting ahead of yourself in a sense because you know from reading verses, from praying, that we do attribute attributes to God. So you know that. However, what you may not know is that this is a very, very complicated question in Jewish theology and has been discussed forever. So let's start with Jeff's side of the equation. We're going to start with text 3. It's on page 42. We'll get back to text 1, whether inside or outside towards the end. It's page 42.
God with wisdom founded the earth, with understanding established the heavens, with his knowledge the depths were split.
Okay, go to text 4.
Unto you, God, is greatness and power and beauty and triumph and splendor. For all in heaven and on earth is yours. Unto you, God, is kingship.
Okay, so here we have 2 verses. The first verse includes the 3 intellectual attributes: wisdom, understanding, and knowledge. The second verse includes the 7 emotional attributes. We're going to see how this verse includes 7 emotional attributes later. So what's important now is simply to note that these verses obviously imply that God has attributes. Yeah. The problem is that this seems to contradict a very basic idea. God is known and referred to in the Haggadah on Passover and in many other places by the term Hakadosh Baruch Hu. Does anyone know what that means? Okay, you want to read text 5?
Transcending attributes. Our sages purposely refer to God as Kadosh, the Holy One, blessed be He, as opposed to the Intelligent One, blessed be He. For God's true self is unknowable. All that we know about God is that He is detached from and beyond every form of physicality and any existing entity. It is therefore appropriate to refer God as the Holy One, for the term Kadosh describes an entity that is transcendent. Indeed, God is
Pashut, Fitut,
the ultimate abstract simplicity.
Intelligence is a very great advantage. But at the end of the day, it's finite. Why? Because you say someone has no intelligence. In other words, you can have it, you cannot have it. There's a limit where intelligence stops and stupidity starts, right? So intelligence is finite. No matter how, you can have someone who will call infinitely intelligent, but there is no such thing as infinite intelligence. So Kadosh, what does holy mean? Holy means that it's totally detached. It's on a different playing field. It's a different field, different ball game. It's a different reality. It's separated. This is too holy, I can't get close to it. It's separated. So God is referred to as the Holy One because He is transcends all attributes, and the term that's used for it is pshitut. Pshitut means simplicity. Now, simplicity, not because we're not intelligent enough to understand. Simplicity because it's simple, that it isn't defined. Water is simple. You can't describe the taste of water. When you add sugar or you add different flavors, now you can describe it. But water itself, obviously water also has a defined texture. And so within this world, we'll use water as an example of simplicity. Yeah, someone who just follows instructions. That's simplicity. Why? Because whatever they're told to do, they're going to do. There is no, you don't have to be worried about what is the person thinking and where's their mind or heart, or what are they going to do, or how will they react, or will they follow through, will they disobey, obey, etc. So which is it? Is God simplicity? In other words, is God devoid of any type of attribute or description or anything good or bad or in between? It doesn't matter. Is God devoid of any of that, or does God have attributes? So Hasidus answers this question by providing a parable. Now, as we discussed last week with a parable, parables are very good if you got the right one, because they can help you understand an abstract idea. We have to be careful because the parable, at the end of the day, is from our lived experience and from our reality. So it's obviously not identical, which is why for this idea, really, Hasidus brings 3 different parables. Each one complements the other, but we are going to focus on one of the parables that's brought to help us understand this idea, or maybe 2. So let's imagine for a second that you're in 6th grade and your teacher invites Sir Isaac Newton to come into your classroom to convey his theory of universal gravitation to this group of teenagers or adolescents. Or what are you, 10 years old, 11 years old in 6th grade? Group of 11-year-olds. So he comes, he's trying to think, what is he going to talk about? And he can't imagine that a group of 11-year-olds is going to understand his theory. So he decides, you know what, I'll just tell them a little bit about my life, a little my childhood and how I grew up. And the teacher says, yeah, but then what's the point of bringing Newton to class? I want the kids to hear something about what makes you you. And he's thinking to himself, how in the world am I going to explain my theory that only the smartest minds in the world can understand to a group of 11-year-olds? So he thinks very, very hard. And then he realizes that there is one idea that he could, that there's a manifestation of his theory in how a chalk can write on the chalkboard, or a marker can write on the whiteboard, or today they have smart boards. I don't even know what they look like. When I was in class, we had the chalkboards. So how the chalk writes on the chalkboards. So he dumbs down one aspect of his theory and brings it out in a very practical and relevant way to 6th graders. And now they can understand what he's conveying to them. This actually reveals how smart and how much of a genius he is. His ability to withhold everything that he is and everything that he has, and take one idea and form it in a way that can be understandable to a 6th grader is an expression of how smart someone is. If you're smart enough that you can teach an idea to an immature mind or to an undeveloped mind, that you're a good teacher. You're brilliant. If you can teach something to someone that is clueless about what you're teaching them, that's brilliance. Now, in this parable, Newton only has one mind, right? He only has one brain, one mind. However, there are 2 levels in his one mind. There is his default status, his mind, the way only he can understand it, and perhaps a select few geniuses in the world that can understand his mind if they would just be exposed to his mind. And at this level, Newton couldn't imagine teaching anything to a sixth grader. However, he projected a second element of his mind, sort of like a reduced or modified version of his mind that is relatable to simple teenagers. Is the second level inferior to the first? Sure. I mean, if you're a professor and you hear Newton's coming to town, so you join the sixth grade class and listen to Newton, are you getting an inferior Newton, or are you getting Newton at his best? You're getting an inferior version. You're not walking away excited about why you came. You're going to feel disappointed if you walk out of the sixth grade class and you're an expert in the field, right? However, was it Newton or was it someone else?
Well, he didn't.
Who did you hear? You heard Newton, but it wasn't Newton the way he was by himself on his own.
Heard the varnished Newton, not the unvarnished Newton.
So the students, and the students also, they heard Newton. They heard his idea. Sure, they didn't understand the whole depth of the idea. They, in whatever manifestation he figured out how to share his idea, they heard a Newtonian idea. But they didn't hear what Newton was truly capable of and who he was if he was talking to professors. Let's look now at a passage from the Zohar in text 6. You are one, but not in a numerical sense. You are exalted above all the exalted ones, hidden from all the hidden ones. No thought can grasp you whatsoever. Okay, this passage, is God numbered? Is there a number to God? Is God made up of different parts, or does God have different components? No. Oh, oops. What happened there? Give me a second. No. I don't know why I can't see anything. 1 second. I apologize. Let's try this. There we go. Okay. Okay. Now let's go to the second part of this passage. You are the one who has brought forth 10 ornaments, which we call the 10 Sephirot, to direct concealed worlds and revealed worlds. So here in this text, we learn about two levels. Two manifestations of one God. In the first paragraph, God is transcendent. Pshitut. Right? He's no attributes. You can't count him. You can't grasp him. Ungraspable. What do we call this level? We call this level Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Holy One, blessed be He. Because it truly transcends any type of experience that we know or can imagine. Okay? Now on your map, if you look on your map, you'll see this is the subject of next week's lesson. Next week, we will talk about, you see the yellow on the left, it says infinite. Okay, the green that we're talking about today is finite, right? We're saying there's 10 attributes. That's finite. That we're going to get to in a moment. But we should remember there's also the way God is infinite. And that's going to be next week's class. We're going to start talking about the infinite aspect next week. So the infinite side, and it's true, God is infinite, it's transcendent, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. But then there's also, and by the way, this is similar to Newton's mind as it is complex and can't be given over to sixth graders. The second paragraph tells us of a second truth, that God ornaments himself with 10 definable and limited attributes, which explains the biblical verses Jeff read before that describe God's knowledge, wisdom, understanding, his greatness, his strength, his power, his beauty, his triumph. This is similar to Newton's mind, the way it's in a sixth grade classroom. It's Newton in the classroom, but it's not Newton as he is himself in his own elements. Or the way you would describe Newton if you had to describe Newton. You would not describe him the way he appears in a sixth grade classroom. And this is the 10 Sefirot. The 10 Sefirot is the way God interacts with the world. And is relatable to us humans and sixth graders. Now, these 10 attributes, these are called Sefirot. This word highlights how God assumes a numbered real identity. 10 and not 11, 10 and not 9, right? There's a numbered identity that God superimposes or assumes. And this is actually one of the meanings of the word Sephira. What does the word Sephira mean? Anyone knows what the word Sephira means?
It means sphere.
Yeah, that's one, but what is the connection with numbers?
Counting.
Very good. Sfirata Omer, the counting of the Omer. If you look in text 7, some have linked the word Sephira to the word mispar, number, which indicates a state of finitude, finite. So Sphira means it's definable. There's a limited. If there's two things, that means the first thing ends and the second thing begins. If it's infinite, you can't have two truly infinite entities, because if it's truly infinite, then it can't be in the same space as something else that's truly infinite. If there are two things that exist, that means there's a place that one ends and the other begins. So once there's numbered objects, now you're dealing in the finite realm. And this finite realm is 10.
Wow.
Sphere is a sphere also, like from the word sphere or sapir, which is like a brilliance, shining, or sipur, like a story, because you're allowed to talk about it. Story is you relate something that's relatable. If you want to describe God the way he is, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, there's nothing you could say. He's nothing. You can't describe him with anything. Spheras is the place you can start describing something. There's something that you can hold on to and describe. We don't know what it is yet. Okay, we didn't discuss what the world of Atzilus is yet, or what the spheres are. But this is one step above last week, which we discussed creations. It's God, so to speak, but it's not God the way he is himself. Infinite, this is the way God has manifested himself in a finite reality. Now, just like we understand that Newton in the 6th grade classroom is not a new idea. He's not sharing a new idea. He's sharing an idea that emanated from his original theory. So you have the Newtonian theory. He somehow dumbed down one specific element of it into a relatable idea and concept that the students can understand. So it's a new idea, but it's not really new. It's an emanation from his original idea. So when God emanates into the 10 Sefirot, this is not a new creation. If it was a new creation, it would be in the world of Bria, which translates creation. It's creating something new. These 10 attributes are not a new creation. They are emanations from God. How could you have finite emanate from infinite? If God is truly infinite, how isn't the number 10 a creation? In other words, if I'm truly infinite, that means there's nothing else besides me. If there's something else, I'm not truly infinite. If I'm truly infinite, there's nothing else. Now let's say I evolve or devolve or emanate into 10 attributes. How did I get from infinity to finitude, to finite? If I didn't create something new, right? So text 8, page 47 tells us that the infinite one, in other words, God, is perfect without any flaw. How perfect is he? Should you assert that he has infinite power, but lacks the power of finitude, you deny his perfection. This is something that it's very difficult for us to walk away and say we truly understand, because we don't truly understand what real infinity is. But if we could just imagine what infinity might be, if we could just imagine what true infinity might be, it would be impossible to limit the truly infinite by saying that he can't be finite. If I say, you're so smart, there's no way a 2-year-old child can understand you, then you're not so smart. If you were so smart, anyone would be able to understand you. Now, you may be a genius in your own mind, but you're missing, if you can't explain yourself to a 2-year-old, you're missing an intellectual power that allows you to take something that's so great and dumb it down to a 2-year-old. It doesn't make you less smart. It doesn't make you less talented. It just means you don't have this talent. So you're not truly infinite. Yeah. But if something is truly infinite, they could do anything. Anything means to do something that's finite. So if you ask, how can God emanate into 10 attributes if he's truly infinite? That question in and of itself means you don't accept that he's truly infinite. If he's truly infinite, he can truly do anything. If he can't do anything, if he can't truly do anything, that's not true infinity. We're going to talk about this a little bit, I think, in lesson 5, when we get to how does God make this transition? Because at the end of the day, it is a transition. It's a transition from infinite without the existence of a finite power or finitude to a status where now it exists. It didn't before. Now it's not a new creation. The potential for it always existed, but it wasn't visible. It wasn't manifested until now. So how does that happen? We'll come back to that later. If we go to text 9a, and then I'll give you an example. We'll bring this out in a practical example that hopefully will be understandable. Someone, oh, okay. I want to see if there we go. So I could see what's going on here. The first of the Sefirot, Chachma, cannot be termed a creation, God forbid, because it is literal godliness. Rather, God condensed his light to the extent that he could manifest himself in Chachma and the other attributes. The intellectual attributes are his attributes. The kindness is his kindness, and so forth. Okay, let me explain a little bit what's going on over here. Let's imagine you have a blank sheet of paper. You'll have to imagine it because I don't have, well, yeah, but that's not blank. That's not truly blank. Okay. You have a blank sheet of paper, and then turn the paper on the other side and imagine that you write on the back side of the paper the word Sefirot. Okay. 1 second. There we go. This word, does it come from the paper? Comes from the pen. In other words, the word is superimposed on the paper. The paper is totally separate from the word. Now imagine you turn the paper back over, it's white. Then you take a piece of black paper and you carve out the letters Sefirot. You scratch out those letters in the black paper, and then you put that paper over the white paper. Yeah? Are the letters coming from connected to the white paper? What do you see? How do you see those letters?
Out of the white paper, but it's not. It's the black cutouts that you're seeing with the back.
No, what you're not reading the black, you're reading the white.
But aren't you? It's not of the paper or the pen. It's of the source that's projecting it. Our mind, our concept, we're projecting Sephiroth out. So wouldn't that be where it's from?
That's true, but imagine your mind being the white paper. Okay, so is the white paper limited to these letters? No, because you could take the black paper off and there's no letters there. You could write whatever you want on the black paper, put it against the white paper, and you'll see those words, right? But with so everything that you are going to see and perceive comes from the white paper, and yet the white paper isn't limited to anything that you're seeing. So you're going to read every word from the white paper, and yet the white paper isn't limited to any of those words.
Aren't you reading basically what's not there? Because it's
Not
cut
where?
out. You know,
The black,
cut
yeah, but
out of
before
black.
you put it over the white paper. Oh, I'm sorry, what?
Because when you cut it out of the black and you put it over the white, you're actually reading what's not, on what's not there.
So why did you need to put it on the white paper? Why didn't you just read it on the table?
That's a good question. Effect. You get a
In
different.
other words,
way.
you don't have to put it on a white paper. Any surface you put it on. In other words, if you would just hold a black sheet with the missing letters and there's nothing behind it, there was another black paper behind it, you wouldn't see anything. The only way you could see the letters is by whatever it is behind it. But whatever it is behind it, it could be a white paper, it could be a green tablecloth, it could be the brown table, doesn't matter what it is. Whatever it is that's behind it, that's what you're seeing. Those are the letters you're seeing. And yet, that backdrop isn't limited to those letters. You can write any word on the black paper and you will read those letters from the backdrop. Let's look at text 9b. Now we're going to understand why it's called Atzilut and what Atzilut means, what this fourth world means. The Sefirot are called Atzilut, page 48. Not Bria. They're not a creation. They're called Atzilut. The term Atzilut in the Torah, the word Atzilut in the Torah comes from the story of Moses when the Jewish people complained that they're sick of the manna, they're sick of this bread that comes from the heaven. They want meat. They want food the way it was in Egypt. And Moses comes to God and says, where am I getting meat for all these people? How can I take care of all these people? So what does God say? God says, gather 70 elders and I will increase the spirit that's upon you and emanate it upon them. That's what he says. The term Atzilut in the Torah comes in Numbers 11:25, and it means emanation. That's the verse. Vayotzel min haruach. He emanated from the spirit that was on Moses onto the other 70 elders, which indicates that the Sefirot are an emanation from God's infinity, not an independent creation. Do you know what the definition of the term emanation means? It comes from, right? Light emanates from the light bulb. What happens if is the light separate from the light bulb? Not really, because if you separate it, if you put something there, you're going to lose the light, right? But is it the light bulb? It's not the light bulb, but it emanates from the light bulb. So it's not an independent creation. It's not a standalone independent creation. This provides us with a second reason for referring to the Sefirot as Atzilut, from the etymological root Eitzel, meaning together with God. So just like Bria last week was a creation, in other words, it's the first independent entity outside of God. It's close, but it's outside. Atzilut means it's an emanation from. So that's the first translation of the word Atzilut, means emanation. It also means together, close. Just like the light that comes out of the light bulb. It comes out of the light bulb, but it's very close to the light bulb. Block the light bulb and you lose the light. And now, I mentioned at the beginning of the Alter Rebbe couldn't write the word Atzilut. He would get stuck after the third letter. Because if you're engaged in what you're writing and you're in that mindset where you are literally in a world that emanates from God and isn't separate from God, that's an awesome experience to be in. And how do you write that on a piece of paper? See, for us, it's just a few letters. Now, here's another term that's used by the Kabbalists. You won't find this in Tanakh, in the scripture, or in the Talmud. So, what do you call this? You can't call it a creation, because it's not a creation, it's an emanation. You can't call it God, because it's not God in the metaphor of the light bulb. It's not the light bulb, it's not the source, it's an emanation. So what do we call it? So the Kabbalists coined the term godliness. In Hebrew, Elokut. The kuf substitutes the hey. We don't want to say God's name, right? So Eloha would be God's name, one of the names of God. We don't want to say that, so we say Elokut. If you look in text 9c, the Sefirot are utterly incomparable to God's essence. Just like Newton in the 6th grade is utterly incomparable to Newton in his classroom or in his mind. For that reason, we refer to them, in other words, to the Sefirot, as Elokut, godliness, as opposed to Eloka, God himself. There's a Hasidic lecturer who says Elokut is God with a last name. In Yiddish, you would say Getlich, Getlichkeit. Gott is God. Getlich is godly, godly, godliness, or Elokut. I'll just round this off with a story, just to illustrate the point that the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, the first Chabad Rebbe, was had a daughter who died at a very young age, and her 3-year-old son was given over to him to educate, to raise. In other words, the father, although he still lived there, but he was a businessman and he had to work. So the grandfather, the Alter Rebbe, raised his grandson. He later became the 3rd Chabad Rebbe. So the story is that he was once sitting on his Zayda. You know what a Zayda is? A grandfather. He was sitting on his Zayda's lap, and he was stroking his Zayda's beard. So the Alter Rebbe asked him, and he was saying Zayda, Zayda. You know, he was a little kid. So the Alter Rebbe tells him, that's not Zayda, that's Zayda's beard. Where's Zayda? So he points to Zayda's head. He says, that's not Zayda, that's Zayda's head. So he points to his eyes, to his nose, to his arms, to his legs, and everything he points to, the Alter Rebbe says, that's not Zayda, that's Zayda's this, that, or the other. After a few minutes, the kid goes around, starts playing, and then he hides by the door and he yells out, Zayda, Zayda. And so the Alter Rebbe comes running, you know, he's scared, the little kid, he's screaming, he's scared something happened. And when he came, he's like, oh, there's Zayda. In other words, last week we discussed garments, thought, speech, and action. That's like a sweater. Yeah? A sweater you can take off, you can put it on. The sefirot are not things you can put off or take off or put on. They are part of you. They're integral. They're a part of who you are, but they're not you. Okay, so let's say an arm. The arm is part of you, but God forbid a person loses their arm, they could still live. So if someone asks you, who are you? You're your arm? No, it's your arm. So it's higher than a garment that you can take off and put on a different one. Your arm, you can't take it off and put on a different one, right? It's an integral part of you, but it's not you. The same is true for Atzilus. Atzilut is it's part of the divine entity. It's part of godliness, but it's not God. You can't look at Atzilus and say, this is God. It's godly. It's an emanation from God. It represents some form or element, but it's not God. But it's not something separate from God either. It's this in-between state that we call elokut, or godliness. It's a good question. Is Shekhinah essential, the essential part of God, or the way, or elokut, the way God manifests himself in Atzilus? And the answer to that is, it depends. There is Shekhinah, and then there is the Ikar Shekhinah. Shekhinah, the way it is today, the way we experience God today, is godliness. The purpose of creation, the purpose of the world, is that we make the world into such a place that God himself will feel comfortable to be here, and that will happen when Mashiach comes. Okay, now that we know there are 4 worlds, the lower 3 worlds are creation. The 4th world it's a world because it emanates from God, but it's not really a creation. It's Atzilus. So we're not going to go through it, but on page 50, you have the 4 stages of prayer. Prayer is a ladder. It's 4 stages of prayer. You have that there. You can look at it after class. We pointed earlier to 2 biblical verses that ascribe specific characteristics to God, the 10 Sefirot. So we know why Atzilut is called Atzilut. It's an emanation and very close to God. Now, what is Atzilut made up? It's made of 10 Sefirot. What are these 10 Sefirot? So we are not going to have time to look through to understand and explain all of them. But if you look on page 53, you have the 10 Sefirot in Hebrew. Then you have the literal translation, which you won't understand much from. Then you have the two verses we discussed, we brought down earlier, and how they divide into the 10 Sefirot. What we are going to do now is we are going to discuss number 4, 5, and 6. Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferet. And these are three general categories. If you look at your map, you will see that generally speaking, they divide, each side divides into three. There's the right side, the left side, and the middle. Okay? So we are going to, and although they're 10 different attributes, they generally speaking divide into three categories. So we'll discuss the three different categories without getting into the specifics of all 10. Today we'll discuss 4, 5, and 6. Next week we'll get a glimpse at 1, 2, and 3. By the way, on page 62, you have all 10, the way they manifest themselves in the human being. But again, that you can go through a little later. So let's go to text 11 and see the three general categories that we will be discussing today: Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferet. Text 11, page 55. The attribute of Chesed seeks to provide without limits, even if the recipient is in no need of pity, lacks nothing, and faces no difficulty. The attribute of Gevura seeks to exercise restraint when providing to others or to refrain from giving altogether. The attribute of compassion seeks to pity whomever is in need. It is the mediating attribute between Gevura and Chesed. For that reason, it is called Tiferet, beauty, akin to a multicolored garment that provides harmonious beauty. Okay, so let's break this down. Chesed, kindness and love, the way it's translated here, is the disposition to give. Give. Doesn't matter who you give to. It doesn't really matter if the other person needs your giving or not. You feel the need to give. In other words, it's not about filling the other person's needs or desires. You know, there was a guy, he once called his rabbi, he needed to speak to him urgently. He comes in and he breaks down. He tells the rabbi with tears in his eyes, you know, there's a family in town. The husband passed away. The wife can't work, too sick to work, 4 kids at home. And if they don't pay rent this month, they'll be evicted from their apartment. We need to help them. So the rabbi says, how much is rent? She says, $800. So the rabbi says, how do you know? She says, I'm the landlord. So chesed is limitless kindness. In other words, chesed is giving regardless of whether the person needs it or not. By the way, who is the epitome of chesed in the Torah? Abraham. Last week's Torah portion, we read that Abraham was very sad when he was standing outside talking to God. Why was he sad? Because there were no guests, no one to take care of. Why was he sad? Everyone's home, everyone has what they need. Why is he sad that there's no guests? Because he felt he needed to give. That's chesed. Chesed is indiscriminate giving. Yes, Amy, there's a question?
So are we talking about these, because these are infinite, we're talking about these as God's attributes, not ours, correct?
Yes.
Okay, because
so far
there's no okay, so far, because there's no way, there's no humanly possible way that a human could express Hesed without any restrictions. Right?
Well, no, not necessarily. Let's see. We'll soon see. Gevura, which usually translates into as strength, implies that no, I'm not going to give. Does the other person need it? And not only does the other person need it, do they deserve it? that they earn it. This is a very calculated giving. This is a very restraining. I'm holding myself back from giving. And here it's all about the beneficiary. It's all about what he needs. I'm not giving more than he needs. And all about what he can handle and what he deserves. The Talmud famously relates a story that everyone here knows of to express the difference between chesed and gevura, kindness and strength. And that's in text 12. A non-Jewish man once approached Shammai and told him, I would like you to convert me to Judaism on the condition that you teach me the entire Torah while I stand on one foot. Shammai used the builder's measuring tool he was holding to chase the fellow away. The prospective convert then approached Hillel with the same request. Hillel converted him, telling him, whatever you hate being done to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the entire Torah. The rest is commentary. Now go and learn the rest. By the way, when people read this story, many people read the story as good guy versus bad guy, which is, consider how you would react if someone approached you and asked you to teach you everything you learned in your life and worked on while standing on one foot. How would you react? Let alone if the discipline you're disciplined in or whatever it is you're working on is something you believe is spiritual in nature and deserves a lot of time and effort, you would see it as very disrespectful and very demeaning and the person doesn't really understand what's going on. Shammai reacted with gevura because he had very high expectations of himself and of others. Really, Shammai was hoping that this rejection would teach the guy that this is serious business. Shammai wasn't rejecting him that, oh, you don't deserve to be converted, or you haven't. Shammai was telling him, you want to convert, that's fine, but get serious. Shammai was hoping he'd come back and take it seriously. Yeah. Hillel, on the other hand, acted with chesed. Hillel realized that even though the person was undeserving, he was going to give it anyway. And hopefully the guy would accept it and would learn his lesson, would advance and figure it out. By the way, just an example of giving without limitation or without consideration of the recipient would probably be if you give someone money that you know or assume they might use it to harm themselves, to buy things that would, drugs or other things that would harm them. This is pure chesed. There's no gevura mixed in. It's just to be kind. You want to feel like you gave something, so you give something. And there's zero thought process about what the other person will, if they'll benefit and how they'll benefit from it. Okay, so let's remember there's two terms that we've learned, as chesed, and then, which is translated usually as kindness, acts of kindness. And this is pure sharing, giving. And then there's gevura, restraint, strength. And then we have tiferet. Tiferet means beauty. When do you have true beauty? When you can harmonize two different things, when you can combine two different things together. So you take a combination of chesed, of kindness, but then you also take a little bit of gevura. We're going to talk next week how you can get, if they're two opposites, how can you combine them? But this is the facts, that tiferet, beauty, is when you combine two things that are that seem contradicting. And this is tiferet. It's beauty. That's when you get something truly beautiful. If you have a color, you have white on its own, not very beautiful. Black on its own, not very beautiful. Mix the two together, and then you can create something, right? There's a shade already to the white, and there's different colors. That creates true beauty.
Course.
Okay, just one more idea. If you look at page 58, why did God do it this way? Create Atzil, emanate Atzilut and have these different attributes, Chesed, Gevura, and Tiferet, because God interacts with the world in these three interactions, right? Sometimes God gives us even though we don't deserve. What's the prime example of God giving us even though we didn't deserve it? So Kabbalah says creation, the fact that he created you. You didn't deserve it. You didn't earn it. He created, right? There's no earning or deserving. Then go through your life and you'll see there have been times that God was strict with you and gave you only what you earned and deserved. There were times God was infinitely kind with you and gave you even though you didn't earn it and deserve it. And then there were times that God was sort of trying to make something beautiful, that you did something, he gave you more than what you earned and deserved, but still it was, comparable to what you earned and deserved. If you look at page 58, figure 2.2, you'll see in our life, in the world, different things that represent chesed and gevura. Some of some of you may be familiar with, for example, meat and milk. According to Kabbalah, although the Torah says the prohibition of mixing meat and milk is a chok, is a statute that we don't there is no reason given for it. But mystically, milk represents chesed, kind life. Milk gives life, right? That's how a baby survives. With milk, it's life. Red is blood. That represents death. You can't mix life and death, chesed and gevura. And there's a whole list of things here that represent the two different extremes. However, not everything in the world is included in this list. Because just like you have three primary colors, and you can have infinite different shades of colors from the three primary colors, there are, 12 musical notes? Yeah?
12 or 7.
7 or 12 musical notes, and any song that has ever been composed or ever will be composed was composed with those 12 notes. So there are 10 sefirot. Anything in the world comes from these 10, or a mixture or a combination of some of the 10. That's why God used Atzilut. God started off with, before he created Bria, before he created the first creation, God emanates these 10 DNA markers, and everything that is going to be created from here on out, spiritually or materially, is combined of these 10 attributes. Okay, so last week was creation, was Biyah. This week is Atzilus. This is the source of creation. How God is going to create the world. And he's going to use these 10, like a plumber who has a toolbox. These are the 10 tools in God's toolbox God is going to use, but they're not tools. Because a plumber, because remember, the parables don't always match. If a plumber's hammer breaks, what does he do? Buys another one. The hammer is not connected to the plumber, whereas these 10 tools are emanations from God. They're godliness. So it's different than a tool, but it's the idea of the tool, that these are the tools God will use, but he will also infuse these tools into the world. These are the colors. These are the musical notes. These are the DNA. This is the DNA that makes up all of creation. So you can have water, that's kindness. What's a human? So everything in the world has 1, 2, 3, a combination. What's a human? How many of these, of the 10 attributes, does a human have? What do you say? You said something under your breath. What did you say? All of them. Very good. You looked at the map. The human was, I know you didn't now, but you paid attention. The human was created in God's image. So God has the 10 attributes. The human is the only creation that is also made up of all 10 attributes. We are the only creation that has, from the highest level of intellect until, so you can have certain animals more intellectual than others, more emotional than others, more actionable than others, but the human is the one creation that has all 10. And now let's figure out how this is relevant to our lives. Let's turn to page 59 and read text 13. This is from the daily prayer, the morning prayer. My God, the soul you placed within me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. Okay, created it. What is that? What does that correspond to with what we learned already? Huh? Bria, right? Bria means created. You formed it. Yetzira. Yetzira is formed. You breathed it into me. That's an action, right? I breathed it into me. Whatever it is you created and formed, you breathed it into me. That's Asiya. Where's Atzilut? The very first line, the second line. The soul you placed within me is pure. We recite this prayer every single morning to remind ourselves of who we truly are. You know, imagine if our souls started in Bria, that would mean that our souls are rooted in Yeshut, that we discussed last week, in independence, in existence, separateness. And the result of that would be we are separate from God. But that's not the case. In the prayer it says, the soul you placed within me is pure. In other words, our soul originates in Atzilut. Our core is pure. Sure, we often stumble. We make bad choices. And when we do, we think of ourselves as being far from pure. But just because a human being acts like a duck, even if a human being talks like a duck or walks like a duck, it doesn't make you a duck. So even if we go through our day thinking of ourselves as created, formed, breathed, we're separate, we're stumbling, we're falling, we remind ourselves that our core identity always remains pure. And if I can remember that, this will inspire me to grow, to introduce more spirituality in our lives, because I'm not dejected by the fact that I fell and that I stumbled and that I made a mistake. And not only that, it empowers me to actually change the world and make it better, because I know what I'm truly capable of. But we have to successfully remind ourselves of that. So yes, last week we discussed of the great importance of focusing on thought, speech, and action, on our actions, on what we do. We have to always remember, even if we think that we aren't good enough, we should remember we also have Atzilut. Even if we have to suppress, every time I do something, I have to suppress my urge to do something negative or do something violent or do something crazy. So I get the feeling that although I can control myself and always act in a positive way, I can't influence others because at the core, I'm not good. I have 10 sefirot. I have 10 attributes. Some of them may seem like they're not good. I'm not the kind person. I'm not the patient person. But those 10 attributes mirror God's 10 attributes, which are close to God, which are pure, which are emanations from God. Those 10 attributes within us, even though they manifest themselves in our physical body, and therefore can be influenced by who we are, but ultimately at their core, they're pure. At the core, they are an emanation from God. They are the soul that God breathed into me. Another important way of thinking about this is we started the class. Before we get there, there is, although each soul has all 10 attributes, each soul has one attribute that is dominant. We saw this before in the story of Shammai and Hillel. Shammai and Hillel were both created in the image of God, which means they both had chesed and gevura, and yet Hillel epitomized chesed, Shammai epitomized gevura. But the soul's root is in a specific attribute. How do you know which root your soul comes from? So on page 61, you'll see an exercise with different attributes on the chesed side and on the gevura side. If you number yourselves, 5 being very dominant to 1 being very weak for each of these attributes, and you count the numbers up, if your numbers lean towards chesed, that means you're more of a chesed dominant person. If they lean towards gevura, you're more of a gevura dominant person. And if they're in the middle, you're more of a tiferet person. And if you want to get more detailed, not just the 3 columns, you want to get more specific within the 10, that's on page 62. You have all 10 with a whole bunch of attributes. You can figure out later at home, you can try to figure out where your soul is on this journey of experience within the 10 Sefirot. Now, why is it important to know where your soul is rooted in? If my soul has everything, why is it important to know where my soul is rooted in? So there's a fascinating Talmudic teaching in text 15 on page 64. And this question makes a very interesting assumption. The Talmud says like this: Rav Yosef questioned Rav Yosef, the son of Rabbah, in which mitzvah was your father most careful? What assumption does this question make? That there's one mitzvah his father was most careful in. He should have asked, was there one mitzvah your father was particularly careful in? But he didn't ask that. He assumed his father was particularly careful in one mitzvah, and he asked, which one is it? In other words, every person has to do all the mitzvahs. But every person should have one particular area in their life that they understand is connected to who they are, and this is their focus. They spend extra time, extra effort, extra intention, maybe even extra money focusing on that mitzvah. So you'll have people that will give a lot of charity, and they won't really spend a lot of time or a lot of money on the mitzvahs they do. Some people will spend a lot of money on a certain mitzvah they do. They won't give exorbitant amounts to charity. They'll give the basics, what's necessary. Some people will spend a lot of time studying one element of Torah, one area of Torah. That last year we had a course on the different areas of Torah, and not the rest. Every person's soul is connected to a certain attribute, to a certain area. And this is something that the Talmud takes for granted. And this is the background of the famous quote of Rabbi Zusha of Anipali that we've discussed many times. You know which quote?
Basically, I don't know if I got it right, but basically, like, I'm not sad that I was in Moshe. I'm sad
when I come up high after 120, I come to the heavenly court, they're not going to ask me why I wasn't like Moses, because what am I going to tell them? I'm not Moses. They're not going to ask me why I wasn't like Abraham or David, because I'm not them. What am I worried they're going to ask me? Why wasn't I Zusha? In other words, why didn't I live the potential that I was meant to live? Why didn't I excel in that area? And every person's different. Just like there are infinite amount of combinations of the 10 Sefirot, which can make infinite amount of creations, right? The 12 notes can make infinite amount of songs. Every Jew, you know why you were created? There has never been someone like you, and there never will be someone like you, because if there was, that's redundant. You are unique. You have that particular combination of the 10 Sefirot, or one of them combined with others, but one that's more dominant. You're the only person that ever was or ever will be that had that combination and can focus on that area in your life. Yeah? And going back to Amy's original question, or not original, but the question towards the beginning, if you look at text 17, this is a fascinating quote from the Sefer HaBoyer. It's a Kabbalistic work, one of the earliest ones, at least attributed to one of the earliest works. It says like this: the attribute of chesed, kindness, declared, for as long as Abraham lived, I did not have to do my work. For Abraham stood in my place and did my job. What an amazing statement. The divine attribute of chesed said he was out of work. And by the way, that's exactly what God wants. God created us, humans. He gave us these attributes so that we, rather than he, would use these attributes in the world. It takes a lot of work to elevate our attributes. They can become as pure and godly as God's attributes, the way they are in its source. But that's our mission. Our mission is to hone in on that element in our life that we should focus on and perfect it as best we can until it becomes as godly as possible. Now, how do we know which element that is? How are you going to know what your DNA is and what you can achieve and what your area of focus should be? What do you think?
Repeat the question, I'm sorry.
How are you going to know which part of life you should focus on? Which attribute you should focus on? So there are many things that go into it. But you want to try to figure out where your soul comes from. So you want to probably try to figure out where you see your soul striving towards, where you find yourself attracted to, what areas you find yourself gravitating towards. You might want to look at where you were born, to what type of family, and what type of environment, what type of education you had. There are many elements you might want to think about that will tell you where you're headed towards, where your focus should be. However, although that is a good guidepost as to where to go, God didn't create us with one specific attribute. He created us with all 10. Because if all we did in life was go on the path of least resistance, or in the path that seems to be the clearest beaten path for us to follow, without trying to work on and enhance the other parts of our soul that are lacking or deficient or are neglected, ignoring all the other elements of who we are, then we're missing part of the mission that we were created for. After all, we were created with 10 attributes, with 10 soul powers, not one. What's a classic example of someone? So before we had Hillel and Shammai, these are classic examples of people that lived what they were meant to, sort of where their soul came from, what their soul powers personified and exemplified. But we see with Shammai something very interesting. We've discussed this in the past. Look at text 18. Shammai would say, make your Torah study a permanent fixture of your daily schedule. Say little and do much. Now listen to this last line and compare this to what you know from the story before about Shammai. And receive every human with a pleasant countenance. What happened the last time? What happened the last time we encountered Shammai? What did he do? He chased the guy out with a measuring stick, with a ruler. And now, receive every human being with a pleasant countenance. That's not the impression we got of the type of person Shammai was. So he didn't practice what he preached. He's saying one thing and doing something else. This was not his default nature. Receiving every person graciously with countenance, this was not something he was born with. And he could have very easily looked at Hillel and said, that's good for Hillel, that's not who I am. But he didn't. He looked at Hillel and he recognize that although there is a lot of benefits and a lot of importance in having the quality of strength and being hard on yourself and being strict on yourself and others, because that will push you to grow and improve. He also recognized that he may be missing some people on the way by going to an extreme. And maybe if he employed a little bit of Hillel, he would bring a few more people into the fold. And so instead of ignoring Hillel and saying, Hillel will take care of the stragglers while I focus on perfecting my strengths, he didn't. Our default is to focus on the things that come easy, on the things that we enjoy, on the things that we are drawn towards. But it's very important to remember that although it's true, we do come from one specific branch of the 10, and the 10, the way they are made up of all 10 till infinity, but we do possess all 10, and we do need to try and improve in all areas in our life, even though the other 9 areas will not be the focus of our life. They won't be the focus of our attention, but we can't ignore them, and we have to work on them as well. So, I want to do something that I don't know if I'll get to do every lesson. I didn't do it last week because it was late. And I don't know how the next lessons will go. But I want to end off with a Hasidic twist to the study of Kabbalah. We studied a Kabbalistic idea today. The world of Atzilut, the concept of an emanation from God that's numbered in 10. In other words, it's not God, but it's godly. We discussed how this is comparable in us. But how is it going to change the way I live my life tonight after I leave here? Or tomorrow morning when I wake up? Last week, we discussed the concept of moda'ani, waking up, first thinking about God, then saying the moda'ani, then washing our hands. This week, we discussed a prayer we say right after that. The first prayer we say after washing the hands, God, my God, the soul that you put in me is pure. You created it, you formed it, you breathed it into me. How will this change our lives tomorrow morning? And in here lies the secret ingredient of Hasidus. That Hasidus tells us to take an idea that we study and to internalize it, to think about it, to meditate on the idea itself, and then figure out how this idea relates to me and can teach me, help me improve and grow tomorrow. And one of the tools that we use for this is nigun, Hasidic melody, a tune. So I have a tune that I'll play, a Hasidic melody. If you'd like to, you could close your eyes, or you could keep your eyes open. I'm not going to tell you what to think about, but I'd like to encourage you to think about something we learned today and try to think, how am I going to, perhaps focusing on the last thing we learned about, considering an area in our life that can, an area in our life that can benefit from a stronger dose of chesed or a stronger dose of gevura, or maybe trying to figure out where we excel in and should put a lot of energy in, and where we struggle in and can use a little more attention to, so that we don't totally neglect it. Mm-hmm. They don't hear it. 1 second. 1 second. I think what I'm going to have to do is play it from the computer, and then you guys will just have to. You know what I'm going to do? No, never mind. I'm going to stop sharing the. No. It's not here. I'm going to try to share the computer sound. Computer audio. Then what's happening? 1 second. Do a thumbs up if you hear it. 1 second. No. 1 second. Why can't I? Thank you very much for joining us tonight. God willing, tomorrow you will receive an email with the link for the recording for the lesson, and we will see you again next week. God willing. If anyone has any questions, the floor is open.